Welcome to Fellowship 1-7, a biblical podcast from Child Evangelism Fellowship for the Christian community. On this podcast, we discuss various biblical topics, passages, and truths, and how those truths have impacted the lives of people around the world. Now, normally at this point, I would introduce myself as your host, Elizabeth Griggs, but in the last few weeks that has changed, and I got married, and I am now Elizabeth Yoder. And if that last name sounds familiar, our last episode, we happened to have a guest who had the last name Yoder, and he is now my brother-in-law. So thanks for attending the wedding and being there. It was great.
Welcome to the family.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So if you hear us being a little bit more snarky or sarcastic to each other, that's why. We are legally related now. So anyway, yes, we have Mervin joining us again. He's going to share a little bit about who he is and a little bit about our statement of faith that we touched on last time with evangelizing the world. Before we dive back into that, Mervin, would you mind just recapping who you are and kind of give us a little bit of an overview of what we talked about last time?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me back. So I work here at headquarters of CEF. I work in the finance department, and so I enjoy doing all those number things every day.
I'm so glad somebody does.
Yes. That's very peaceful. I was a public educator for 12 years before I worked here. I taught middle school, and so you can imagine how much I enjoy the peace and quiet of our office.
I'm sure.
I love doing the numbers and all that stuff. So I've been here a little over a year, and I've done ministry in my local church for many years, about 20 years now, since I received Jesus. And so that's really been my main focus in ministry. But since I've started here, I've taken a lot of what CEF has to offer and plugged it into what our local church offers. So we started a Good News Club. We run it as a bus ministry in the evenings rather than at the local school. There is another one at the local school, but we find that not all children can stay after school because of transportation, and so we run it as a bus ministry, and it's been a great blessing to have that ministry. I feel like I'm learning a lot about ministering to children because that's not really my background either. I've worked mostly with teens, and so I've really enjoyed growing in this way.
You know what? I work with teens and kids, and I feel like they're pretty much the same. Teens are just stretched. They're bigger.
Oh, okay.
At least in my experience. I can treat them pretty much the same. But that's a really neat opportunity of going and working with kids it's a new area. And it's, like you said, a whole lot of learning and fun, a lot of fun conversations. The random questions from kids, I feel like, are a little bit more entertaining than what you get from teens.
Yeah.
Kids like to pick apart everything, and teens just sarcasm. Anyway, we'll move on. So last time we kind of dove into what evangelizing is, and you had a bunch of words that you defined. Would you mind just don't go into a whole lot of detail about this,
yes,
but just
try.
kind of summarize?
Yeah, so the word evangelism, real quick, is just the word angel is in there, which is messenger, and the EV in front of it is a Greek word eu, meaning good, and so it's just bringing a good message. And so hopefully, if you follow Jesus, you consider it a good message worthy of bringing to other people. And we are commissioned by Jesus to take this message to others. And so that word commission means he has all the authority, but he gives us some of that authority so that we are co-workers with him. And we share in this ministry of reconciliation to bring the gospel to others.
So we talked about that. We also talked about missionaries and how they you summarized it, or you stated that they're kind of like superheroes.
Yes.
Superheroes of the Christian faith. That was a fun discussion. But
Yeah.
we touched on that. We touched on Paul and then a couple of the missionary stories that we share in our Good News Club curriculum.
And I'm going to throw in a point I left out last time.
Okay, go for it.
In his letter to 2 Timothy, we talked about how Paul was alone at the end of his ministry and those things. But for most of that letter, he's encouraging Timothy to follow in his footsteps and to also be willing to suffer. And he has this cool little passage about being vessels for honor. And he goes through these things about being cleansed, being sanctified. And he talks about, let's see what else he says. I have it right here. So it's cleansed and sanctified, and being useful to the master, and being prepared for every good work. And I feel like those things all go into this idea of evangelizing, that we have to be cleansed ourselves. We have to be set apart for this purpose, which the commission sets us apart. And to be useful and prepared, a lot of that preparation really comes from just obedience. Like as you share the gospel, you become prepared at the same time to share it again.
Right.
And so I feel like missionaries, they go down this road where they're just constantly dying to themselves and sharing. And that just prepares them for greater and greater work throughout their life.
Yeah, I would say so. So knowing that this is such a big decision in following Jesus and ultimately dying to yourself every day, why do we as a ministry, why do we emphasize this in the lives of children?
Well, I think our founder, Mr. O, realized that children were neglected in this way. It's not that we think only children should be presented with the gospel. We believe, as our statement of faith says, that all creatures should be presented with the gospel.
Yeah.
By that, I mean humans, of course.
I mean, we can talk to the dog if we wanted to, but yes, humans.
But we have this commission to all. But what Mr. O found is that oftentimes churches neglected children in the sharing of the gospel. And so really, this ministry is kind of, I guess, a correction to that, is that we want to make sure that children also hear the gospel.
Right. And biblically, we see even in Matthew, the Greek word that's used there is paidion. I'm assuming that's how you say it. I am not good at remembering how to pronounce these things, but it's in reference to a little or young child. So we see even when Jesus calls a child and says, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like a child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And so we see even there that Jesus is emphasizing investing in children and evangelizing to them.
Yeah, so we see it in Jesus' ministry. I think he did that a lot with all of those who seem to be marginalized in society, that he gave prominence to a lot of people that the Jewish society at that time would not give any attention to.
Right.
And children is one of those that he gave attention to those children and wanted them to come.
So we see it in the New Testament. And then you were talking about how in the Old Testament, in, I believe you said Deuteronomy, it also talks about investing in children and helping them grow and in their faith even. Yeah,
so this is, I feel like a pretty familiar passage to many people, but it's Deuteronomy 6. And this is where we get part of the greatest commandment. This is the first part of the Shema, which is a Jewish prayer, they say. And, he talks about you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And so we pull those words out. But in the very same prayer, he talks about you shall teach them diligently. So teaching them is the words or the commandments. Mm-hmm. You shall teach the commandments diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. And so even in the Old Testament, God is emphasizing that we should be teaching our children the commandments of God.
Right. Even though we see this emphasis on children in our ministry, but even throughout Jesus and his ministry and, referencing kids when he's calling them to them and saying, hey, become like a child. Does that in any way limit those who could be introduced to Jesus? If we're saying that children are who you should become like, does that mean that as an adult you can't be introduced to the gospel and you can't accept Jesus in the same manner that a child could?
No.
Great answer.
It doesn't mean that. Of course, Jesus uses the word like, which is, so he's using a figure of speech there saying, so the question is, what does it mean to become like a child to receive the gospel?
Right.
And so I think, in my mind, it's this attitude of dependence on God, or you humble yourself before God, you're willing to learn from God. And I think that humility is the comparison that Jesus is making there.
Right. And we can also see how Jesus calls even adults. We can think of Paul and his conversion, how Jesus appeared to him and called him to be an apostle, or Simon the sorcerer or the Ethiopian eunuch. And we see how God transformed their lives as adults. They weren't limited to being a child and following Christ.
Right. One of the things that we see a lot in CEF trainings is they will ask people to raise their hand to show when they were saved. And so many times people, oftentimes they're saved at a very young age, you know, as children. But we also see hands go up for, they're an adult and they were saved. And that was my case. I was 18 after high school when I really understood the gospel and wanted that relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And so it can happen at all ages.
Right. So we see that in your life. And then there are also popular people that have committed their lives to Christ at an older age. Franklin Graham was 22 and accepted Christ. I mean, and he had been introduced to the gospel since he was a kid, but it took till the age of 22 for him to claim that salvation as his own. And then if you've ever heard of Luis Palau, who is a founder of a young adult ministry, his son Andrew, who again was introduced to the gospel at a young age. It took him until he was 27 to fully commit to following Christ. So yeah, no is the answer. Adults can also be saved. So if we know that adults can be saved, why do we have special emphasis on child evangelism?
I'll give a couple reasons. So one is it's scriptural to teach these things to our children. We see that in the Old and the New Testament. I think there's also warnings in Scripture about what happens when we don't do this. We can read in Judges in the first chapter what happened when Joshua died. He passed away, and all the elders of that generation also passed away. And it says there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. And then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And so they forsook the Lord. And so I think that is kind of a warning to us what happens when we don't teach our children about the Lord, is there's a falling away from truth. And so that's an imperative for us. We want to teach our children these things. But I think the other aspect of it is just understanding how we form as humans, that a lot of times the foundation for our life is laid at a very young age. Mm-hmm. And so Barna, who many of you are probably familiar with, he published an article in 2003. And the title of the article is just that research shows that spiritual maturity process should start at a young age. And so he goes through a lot of research about, and again, it's just survey information, like data that he looks at about when people receive Jesus. But really, I think maybe a better way, a better lens to look at this through is, when do all people form their core beliefs? Right. And I think for everyone, it's at a young age, not just receiving Jesus. And so he had this paragraph. I wanted to read part of it. And he said, he wrote, adults essentially carry out the beliefs they embraced when they were young. The reason why Christians are so similar in their attitudes, values, and lifestyles to non-Christians is that they were not sufficiently challenged to think and behave differently. And when they were children. So simply getting people to go to church regularly is not the key to becoming a mature Christian. Spiritual transformation requires a more extensive investment in one's ability to interpret all life situations in spiritual terms. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about CEF's curriculum, is that we understand that commitment to following Jesus is really the first stepping stone into spiritual life with God. Mm-hmm. And so it's not about teaching fun Bible stories or getting them to act like Christians before they receive Jesus. But it's really about that first stepping stone is, do they trust in Jesus?
Right.
So Barna goes on to say that through his research, he discovered that a person's lifelong behaviors and views are generally developed when they're young. And I think sometimes we need a survey to figure this out. Like, it's pretty common sense, but I guess it's good to have data to back it up.
Right. You would know working with numbers.
Yes, I do like numbers. And so, and he says, especially before they reach the teenage years. And so he actually, through his data, he said a person's moral foundations are generally in place by the time they reach age 9. Mm-hmm. And so I was reflecting on my own journey that even though I didn't receive Jesus until I was 18, I did have, for part of my childhood, a Christian upbringing. So my family, when I was born, we were Amish. And so the Amish, they teach, they're Christian, they teach the Bible and that. And so I had some foundation there. And when we left the Amish, we kind of fell away from all of that for quite a few years. And in fact, my family was a disaster in many ways after that. And so I really sought for something more meaningful in my life, which is why I received Jesus. But I did have that foundation from a young age that I think helped me understand the gospel.
Right. So, so CEF emphasizes child evangelism because that is when children ultimately, as we're seeing in this Barna research, when their beliefs are established, and we want to invest in them as much as possible, just like a parent would.
Yes. But we cannot rule out the power of Christ to transform anyone.
Yes.
So we do not say that only children can be saved.
Yes.
That is not scriptural.
Correct.
But we understand that God wants us to give kids that foundation. Mm-hmm. But he is definitely able to transform anyone.
Yep. So I would love to continue this conversation, but unfortunately we are very much out of time. Thanks again for joining us. I've really appreciated all you've had to share. It's been very insightful and fun. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Anytime, Mervin, anytime. If you would like to learn more about who CEF is and what we believe, you can visit cefonline.com/about. This will be linked in the show notes. Be sure to check out Unite Radio, where we unite kids with the gospel through adventures and foundational biblical truths. Give us a like and subscribe to keep up to date on both this podcast and our kids program. Thanks for listening.